after this about the findings, anything that you all might pull from this as insights, any opportunities and questions that you might have about the Hampton Roads startup ecosystem. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. All right, so I've gone through sort of an intro and a summary of Techstars and why Techstars is in Hampton Roads. So this program, this Community Catalyst program that I'm working on is in partnership with 757 CoLab. So I've gotten a tremendous amount of support from 757 Accelerate and 757 Angels to do this work in Hampton Roads. But at the beginning of this engagement, we built out a reporting of data that looked at the sort of health and vibrancy of the startup ecosystem. And we pulled a few different opportunities, strengths, and gaps. We looked at the entrepreneurial output. We looked at things such as talent and capital. We looked at the support that entrepreneurs get from various institutions. And we compared them against the 100 largest US metros in the US by population. And so we looked at Hampton Roads as on the MSA level. Obviously, we are a very unique region with 7 independent cities and I believe 13 different municipalities. And so we took the MSA level data and we compared it to other large US metropolitan areas. And for all of the different areas where we examined Hampton Roads, we fall 39th in the 39th percentile for entrepreneurial vibrancy and health. And so we've got a number of different strengths. We've got some very strong and longstanding institutions, universities, research organizations, and large corporates. But we are behind in startup activity and capital. We're also very strong in diversity. We've got a large number of technical talent, which are 2 ingredients that are very important for a vibrant startup ecosystem. A lot of that talent and a lot of that diversity is sort of occupied in-house at different companies, and not much of it is sort of cycling around the startup ecosystem. And so some of the aspects that we looked at that I'll dive deeper into for this presentation include the rate of innovation, the talent that's in the area, the capital that's circulating in the area, the amount of entrepreneurship in small businesses, especially high growth VC backable entrepreneurship activity, the strength of industry, the benefits and the strength of government in the state, the university support that entrepreneurs receive, the infrastructure that's in Hampton Roads, so connectivity, both digital connectivity and sort of like physical infrastructural connectivity of like the physical space, dynamism, diversity, and lifestyle. And so as far as entrepreneurial activity goes compared to the 100 largest metros, we are roughly half. So we're 53rd versus the 100 that we've measured. And, oh, sorry. This is the full picture of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and not the entrepreneurship activity. And so when you take all of these different factors, and I believe there were 10 of them, when you take these 10 different factors, this is sort of the breakdown of Hampton Roads compared to what Richmond and Washington look like. And then we compare again to Raleigh and San Francisco along those 2 factors as well. And so this is, these are some of the larger takeaways from the report. Entrepreneurial activity is lagging. Again, specifically related to high growth venture-backed exits and high value industries. But there are a few bright spots in the region, specifically in sort of manufacturing and like maritime and shipbuilding, also aerospace for obvious reasons. The industrial structure is also a challenge. We lack some of the industrial resources needed for high-tech innovation and entrepreneurship. There are, however, lots of talented people in deep tech and emerging industries, and there's a tremendous opportunity to leverage that and to leverage the diversity for to carve out what Hampton Roads would look like in this conversation, the national conversation about startup ecosystems. So not building another Silicon Valley, not trying to replicate another Austin or New York, but to build a high growth startup ecosystem that looks and feels and builds on the strengths of Hampton Roads. All right, so I'm going to skip down a couple and dig into some of these components just a little bit. So this is the really important slide, the second slide in each of these groups. So we looked at things like business formations in the last 5 years. We looked at VC financing and VC-backed exits in recent history. We looked at the number of companies on the Inc. 5000, and what we determined was that high growth activity, as reflected in the Inc. 5000, is above the median, both a number and a per capita basis. So these are typically companies outside of the tech sector and mostly in sort of a services sector. The challenge, though, is that the activity across sort of like the high value industries in the VC backable space is lagging behind others in the top 100 metros. So we've got a lot of really fast growing services based and non-technical based companies in Hampton Roads, and not a lot of activity in sort of the VC backable high growth startup space. And it looks like there's a question. So examples of resources lacking, infrastructure for high tech industry growth. All right, so I want to get back to that question in just a little bit, and I might ask that you turn your camera on to sort of clarify the question, but give me 1 second. We'll put a pin in that and get right back to it. So the opportunities, the rate of startup or the startup rate within the high value industries is around the median. But because of the infrastructure lacking in the area, there are fewer in number here compared to the 100 largest metros. So that's to clarify sort of like the entrepreneurship activity component for this measure. For innovation activity, I mean, this is an area where we've got a lot of great research institutions, universities, different labs, and NASA and institutions like that are creating a lot of innovative IP. And I think that, this report pulls out that that innovative IP tends to be trapped within organizations and not released to the broader community to become sort of like a VC backable startup. We have a large concentration of recipients of SBIRs. We've got a lot of talent, again, STEM talent that are employed in these organizations. And so we've got sort of the bones of a very innovative sort of corporate space. But again, it is housed within these corporates and not circulating in the tech ecosystem or the startup ecosystem. So again, the opportunity here is that there's a large share of workers actively engaged in technical domains, and there's a base of talent to support more tech-enabled entrepreneurship. That's reflected again in these numbers for talent. A really interesting challenge that we have here in Hampton Roads is related to capital. So a strength of the region is that there's, the region has demonstrated that it has the ability to secure federal government dollars for early stage financing through vehicles such as SBIR. The challenge, however, is that the region is behind in just about every aspect of venture capital financing, both deals, dollars invested, numbers of investors, and it's falling in the bottom 25% for each of those measures on a per capita basis. The opportunity here is that capital follows deals. Developing more high-tech startups with traction will draw capital to the region, and so will building networks with outside investors and training local founders and operators to be investors. So the really interesting sort of catch-22 about capital, and especially with regards to sort of localized capital, is something that I think is being brought into more stark relief during the past 2 years of addressing the pandemic, is that we've seen that a number of investors are more willing to invest outside of their backyard. And so there are a number of Hampton Roads startups who are looking outside of Hampton Roads for investment, but choosing to remain here, headquartered in the region, which is a great opportunity, not just because obviously it's a great opportunity for those startups that are getting investment, but it's a great opportunity for cross-pollination as well. With regards to industry, we found that on an absolute basis, the region has a roughly median amount of Fortune 1000 public companies, and those institutions can be resources for entrepreneurs. So whether it's mentorship for startups in a program like 757 Accelerate, or if it's in-house innovation at some of these corporate companies, or whether it's one of these larger businesses becomes sort of like a first customer, there is a real opportunity for sort of like a cataclysmic sort of interaction between startups and larger businesses. And again, these large companies are in, technical spaces, sort of deep tech and cutting edge technologies that could start to carve out a niche for Hampton Roads in this broader national conversation about startup ecosystems. A challenge is that the region is saturated in services and lacking in high value, tradable, or product-based businesses, which affects the rate of entrepreneurship in these areas. On a per capita basis, large anchor firms are in the bottom quarter nationally. The opportunity here is that these larger companies can invest in the ecosystem by mentoring, again, by becoming sort of the first customer, by providing or unleashing talent and circulating their resources within the ecosystem, and enabling new clusters to form new sort of like backbone industries for the region. We did rank high for the business regulatory and tax environment. We rank above average for business friendliness of the government. So the state of Virginia has favorable corporate and capital gains tax rates which advantages startup entrepreneurs, employees, and investors in Hampton Roads. The challenge is the data. There's no high quality, consistent cross-metro resources that provide insight into sort of like the MSA level data. The regulatory burden is very broad-based. And while Virginia is good around the median, policymakers can improve conditions so that entrepreneurs may succeed. So there's room for improvement. I think we've all sort of seen the stories where there is I believe it was a CNBC report that called Virginia the friendliest state for entrepreneurs. And so that's a great opportunity for the state of Virginia that trickles down obviously to the MSA level. So we are about middle of the road when it comes to university output and the university's role in the ecosystem. We've got 3 tier 1 and tier 2 research universities in the region, in William & Mary, Hampton, and ODU. So we sort of span the geography with those 3, and 2 research institutions in the top 150 for technical commercialization around startups, which are ODU and EBMS. On both of those measures, the region is in the top 16% of metro areas. The challenge, though, is that the region lacks a sort of globally recognized program in engineering and technology, although William & Mary is recognized nationally in business and computer science. The opportunity here is to leverage the assets of the universities, including our number of HBCUs, for the benefit of the startup community. And what this is saying is, while we do have universities here who are very active in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, you know, there's a certain feel that you get when you're in Boston and you have a number of sort of like MIT grad founded companies. I mean, that sort of pedigree goes a really long way in VC conversations and in attracting talent and those sorts of aspects. So using the strengths of the university, having sort of like encouraging entrepreneurship inside of the university, having less friction in the tech transfer space could all contribute to greater vibrancy in the startup ecosystem. And infrastructure. So hopefully part of this will answer the question in the Q&A. But Hampton Roads has opportunities here to improve on the infrastructure to benefit high growth startups. So the digital infrastructure is strong with fixed and mobile broadband speeds, with high fixed, mobile and broadband speeds. Adequacy of public transit is above the US median, although we can all probably agree that the lived experience is maybe a little bit different from the statistical research based experience here. Some of the challenges include broadband access to sort of like the fringes of the region and connectivity across 2 major VC hubs. And that is related to sort of like the physical geography of the space. The physical connectivity is a point that the Techstars research team pulled out as a weakness of the area. And that's not only connectivity within Hampton Roads, but connectivity between Hampton Roads and other regions. So things like direct flights to different VC hubs or just ease of transportation within the city are all measured to sort of give a feel for the connectivity of the physical space, which, you know, connectivity, both digital and physical, lead to more productivity for industry and for businesses. The opportunities here include sort of a direct commercial flight between here and San Francisco or San Jose. And Norfolk could help attract outside capital, particularly as local companies have begun to raise outside of Hampton Roads. So dynamism, this is looking at the rate of sort of cross-pollination and movement within our startup ecosystem, both inward and outward. And a strength here is that there's a large prime working age population and a very high growth rate of both in-migration and out-migration. So there's a lot of movement in and out of Hampton Roads. A lot of this obviously does have to do with our military connected entrepreneurs and other service people. So rates of dynamism in the business sector are near the median, but are good for the rate of relative to the rate of population growth here. A challenge is that while the population is growing, it's at a relatively low rate. placing our population growth in the bottom third of top 100 metros. And again, I have to preface this all by saying that this is using data that was available sort of pre-pandemic or mid-pandemic. I do know, having conversations around the community with different organizations, that in particular, the dynamism of Hampton Roads has changed significantly during the pandemic, with a lot of in-migration of both technical talent and employees from startups across the country moving into the area, because this whole section of sort of like lifestyle-based metrics, the dynamism, the connectivity, the like quality of life are so high. So you can sort of observe the change in the ecosystem in real time, and how important it is for sort of these like quality of life metrics in solving some of these challenges with talent coming to and staying in the area because of the quality of life, with capital being recontextualized now that it's easier for companies to raise outside of Hampton Roads and stay here. And so some of the challenges, however, with the dynamism component is that while the population is growing, again, it's growing at a relatively low rate, but that means that the high rate of in-migration is partially offset by a high rate of out-migration. Understanding and perhaps mitigating this aspect could improve, again, talent retention, startup investability, and ensuring meaningful work for the swelling population of young people in the region is imperative. So these are all sort of like living, breathing changes that are happening in the region. Hampton Roads obviously ranks very high on the diversity component. Hampton Roads is second among all metros for region-wide diversity, the share of women and minorities employed at new firms, and the rate of female-founded venture-backed startups, and the share of population from out of state are all near the top. Obviously, of course, you can contextualize that a little bit with sort of like the lived experience in Hampton Roads, and understand that a lot of this has to do with the significant sort of military presence in the area. However, a strength nonetheless. There's a lot of very talented, STEM educated and STEM employed, diverse talent in the region, and constantly cycling through the region. Challenges, however, is that the foreign-born share of population ranks among the bottom third, and it's a metric that's often associated with high growth entrepreneurship. An opportunity here is that this doesn't establish the level of diversity within the region. That is, whether people with diverse identities are actually working together. So again, this is another data versus lived experience sort of component. There's a lot of diversity in Hampton Roads, but there are certainly opportunities for inclusion and equity, and for the diversity to work together for the benefit of the region. And lifestyle and culture sort of go hand in hand here. Hampton Roads offers I would call, great quality of life. The schools are strong, as is the sense of community here. We've got a lot of social capital, a lot of people carrying sort of like the torch of the 757, both in Hampton Roads and outside of Hampton Roads. The region is rich with social, cultural, and natural amenities. Housing affordability and community requirements are around the median. Challenges, however, are the minimal existence of walkable neighborhoods, which increases the burden on transit and reduces the quality of life. It also makes increasing startup density more difficult. So again, this is sort of reflecting back on the infrastructure challenges, We are a geographically pretty disconnected community, which makes it hard for there to be sort of like a hub, like a very dense hub of startup activity centralized in one of the several municipalities in the region. The opportunity here is that we could consider meaningful ways to increase physical density of startups and founders and continue to invest in the community. So there are a number of different efforts to do this, from assembly in downtown Norfolk to the innovation space that they're building out in Virginia Beach, and Brooks Crossing in downtown Newport News. I think that what's going to be unique for Hampton Roads compared to other metros in this study is that, you know, there will almost have to be sort of like a distributed but very well connected set of different hubs physically located in the area. So culturally, we've got a fairly innovative entrepreneurial culture. Across business types, the region has a fairly high prevalence of serial entrepreneurs and founders who pursue entrepreneurship for innovative purposes, rather than simply to just sort of like run a company and be one's own boss. There are a lot of entrepreneurs that we surveyed for the study who consider entrepreneurship and their entrepreneurial sort of like tendency as a part of who they are. Challenges, however, include a very low percentage of business owners who are positioned for global markets or high success outcomes. So very few IPOs, very few mergers and acquisitions, and a culture of mentorship hasn't taken hold. And to clarify that, you know, we've got a lot of people who have raised their hands to mentor entrepreneurs. There's a number of organizations who offer different courses and different resources, and there's never been more available for the early stage entrepreneur to start a business. But the culture of mentorship that sort of Techstars espouses in a community is founder focused and what we call give first. And that's really important because it sets the right sort of tone in a startup ecosystem. If you've ever been to like a Boston or an Austin or out in Silicon Valley or in Oakland, then or Boulder, where Techstars is based, you get the sense of a very founder first ecosystem where the wants and needs, I guess, of the organizations and institutions take sort of a backseat to the wants and needs of what an entrepreneur or, you know, what the startup community wants. And so that is really important for us in Hampton Roads to be able to replicate. The opportunities here is that through education and mentoring programs, founders can learn how to scale outside of the region, and growing mentorship networks will expand opportunities and inspire others to be a part of the startup ecosystem. And so, yes, there's more on our methodology. We did both first person and second person research, interviewing hundreds of people in Hampton Roads ecosystem. We pulled data from PitchBook and Brookings Institution and the SBA. We had the author of Startup Community Way was also a lead on this project, Ian Hathaway. And so those are some of the findings. I mean, we shared a report in April that discussed the 5 or so opportunities and the 5 or so gaps for the startup to accelerate the startup ecosystem. And since this time, my work has been to sort of address these gaps and to grow community and density of entrepreneurs and mentors in the area. And one way that I've done that is through a digital community primarily. It's the 757 startup community. If you go to 757startupcommunity.com, you can find a number of different ways to connect to my work and to the startup community. There's a link to the Slack. There's a link to my Calendly if you want to, schedule some time to chat. There's a link to the calendar of events, which has been an interesting endeavor in the middle of a pandemic with changing mandates and regulations around that, but there is a calendar of events. But I would say probably the most impactful effort of this Community Catalyst program has been the Slack. It addresses the biggest issue pulled out of this report, which is just like the sheer connectivity of the startup community. And it's a place that is founder first, that is very much like mentor driven, a very generous group of people who, connect to do what they can to help founders. And so I would highly encourage us, we're exploring this conversation about community and how to grow density community and culture for startups in Hampton Roads, that you explore the 757 Startup Community Slack. And so with that, I will open the floor for questions, and it looks like there are a few.
We do have a few. Before we go into that, is this report available for public consumption? It's available to share via email?
Yes, I can share a version of this. I can share actually the public report with you that I gave.
That would be fantastic, and I'll forward it out along with a link to our recorded video to the attendees. So, but with that, yes, you have some questions in chat. I'll get out of your way.
Okay, actually, Dan, if you wouldn't mind sort of like facilitating the questions.
Happy to do that. Happy to do that. So my friend Rich is still online. The first question was examples of resources lacking with infrastructure for high-tech industry growth. And so, such as the high-speed fiber ring, which we know is an active project, but is that what you're referring to? And are there any other activities that we should know about beyond, we know the fiber ring is super important?
Yeah, so the fiber ring is an example of one. And so when this report speaks to infrastructure, it's speaking to both like the physical and digital infrastructure in the region. And so I can say that one, I guess if I was like poking holes at this report, I would say that one possible weakness is that occasionally there's a disconnect between the statistical sort of reporting of this, like the data outcomes, and sort of the lived experience of Hampton Roads, because we rank pretty high among the top 100 metros in infrastructure. However, I think we would all sort of agree that there's a considerable opportunity to develop the infrastructure component. I mean, it says we have very strong public transportation, which I don't know that most people who live in Hampton Roads or who've been here longer than a week or two might agree with. So, but yes, this is speaking to both the physical and digital infrastructure. We've got, I would say, probably great digital infrastructure and even more awesome programs and projects in the pipeline. And the physical is a challenge for the area.
I mean, certainly the cables coming out of the ocean are a wonderful primary pillar to some of this stuff. Rich, I know you're still online. Does that answer your question, or did you have a follow-up for Oz?
Yeah, so it kind of answers the question, but this is a great presentation, and I really will study the slides that you send out. But for the last 6, 8, 10 years now, what strikes me is we never pin down around here which components need to be more proactive and actually commit to doing more things. Is it individual businesses? Is it regional collaborations? Is it government things? Is it the state helping the region? That sort of detail, which is hard to come by, is really never discussed. And The other thing is that last question I put up there, which is about the metrics. Some of the metrics seem to be about consequences of other actions which might give us higher rankings. I mean, the in-migration would come about as a result of big Fortune 1000 companies moving here, I would assume. So I would think of that metric as a consequence as opposed to a metric which leaders should focus on to say, we ought to figure out how to attack that particular metric to improve what we're doing here in Hampton Roads. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And I do agree that there's an apparent mix of sort of like leading and lagging indicators in this report. I will say that this particular report is, sort of a retrospective, like a current and near like past sort of assessment of the health of the ecosystem. The report that I'm going to share with Dan to get to all of you all does speak more to sort of recommendations for what to do with this data. So what sorts of things, what kinds of efforts would have, the greatest impact for Hampton Roads, and what, organizations and startups and investors and everyone can do to sort of act on the data that's in this report that I'm presenting right now.
My experience in talking to many of the small companies that are out there, and Rich, you were asking a question earlier about, well, what about this and that, and the answer is yes or no based on what company you're talking to. Some are better connected to those regional resources than others. Some think they're more useful than others, and so that's a variety of opinion. But generally, the takeaway that I had was that the organizations, the companies felt pretty good about the supportive resources in the region. However, there was a consistent underlying comment that I heard time and time again, and not quite sure what to do about it. And they said, we need exposure, we need sales leads, we need connectivity to the people that are buying, and so that's the age-old challenge for independent business, but it still exists here. And so where through your efforts, Oz, the efforts of the Alliance to help promote the resources, the companies, the availability of technology solutions in Hampton Roads for national, if not international, problems and challenges is a huge opportunity for us. And so, but the challenge is, how do we do that? So, food for thought. So so let's see, we have some other questions. I think I wrote. So these are all kind of related. So you use the word traction, and traction is can be thought of as a synonym to success. So how are we measured in terms of success / traction compared to some of the other regions that you looked at?
Right. So the entrepreneurship slides really speak to, I guess, the traction or sort of the success rate for a couple of different markers. Like, I think this is where we speak to the successfulness of the ecosystem, the successfulness of the ecosystem at creating high growth, venture backable startups and startups that have exited. So we looked at, 10 different metrics here for everything from business formations in high value industries to VC exits to number of firms on the Inc. 5000. And we are below average. We are in the 23rd, the bottom quarter percentile among those activities. And I mean, depending on how much time everyone has, I can speak to my own experience growing a software startup here 3-4 years ago, but the numbers are low pretty much across the board, except for when we look at things like Inc. 5000 firms, which the Inc. 5000 measures firms that are growing rapidly in revenue and in headcount. And that includes service-based companies. And so we've got a high number of fairly successful service-based companies. And again, if you were to scratch below the surface of that number, you would see that many of them are, you know, contracting organization or businesses for, you know, the DoD, who, you know, you want to contract, you get a big project, you staff up quickly. And I mean, I think that the actual story behind the numbers is like interesting to really examine here. But yes, I think that like the entrepreneurship component is a really big umbrella, and it's kind of a virtuous or vicious cycle depending on how you look at it. But deal flow encourages investors to participate, but also investors in the area with capital they're willing to invest in startups encourages more startups to grow and thrive. So it's, you know, the age-old chicken and egg thing. And yes, I mean, at this point now I'm rambling because there's so much going on when you talk about startup traction and startup success that, back to Rich's question, are both sort of like leading and lagging.
It all makes perfect sense. Which leads me to the second question I had, Rich. I know you got another one coming up if you haven't done it already, but I promise we'll get to it. So I said, well, Ferguson is an example out there, and of course, what we're lacking is a lot of corporate HQs. We've got some large presence organizations that are spread out, and some of them do some good things. And I think you referenced some of that earlier in your remarks, Oz. But when we look at a company like Ferguson, and we have 757 Accelerate, which is another great resource, and of course Angels and what you are doing. It's all great resources. But at what point, I don't know how rhetorical this question is, but at what point do we focus our energies, the energies of those resources, some of those resources, and there's a finite number of companies that are coming out of that funnel that are most set for success and traction to build upon for the region. In other words, what can a Ferguson do, or what can a PRA do, or what can a Cox do? Barrett, I hope you don't mind my mentioning Cox if you're still on board. You'll see it on the video anyway. But what can some of these, you know, we used to have Norfolk Southern, but what can some of these large companies do beyond mentorship to springboard success opportunities for some of our startups? Loaded question.
I mean, if I had the answer, but
Right.
So from my just sort of vantage point, I think that, you know, I think that the Ferguson Ventures program was, or is, it's very well intentioned. I think that their mission is spot on, to find problems that Ferguson would like to solve, and then match those, not just the problems that they want to solve, but also the talent inside of Ferguson and the investment from Ferguson, matching those with companies who are solving that problem in Hampton Roads, or encourage the kind of environment where someone who is entrepreneurial, which the study says we have a number of those types of people in the region, to encourage people who are entrepreneurial to tackle those problems. And not to go off on sort of like my own personal interpretation of this report, but my own personal interpretation of this report is that we've got a lot of really talented and entrepreneurial people in the region who need to be properly incentivized to take that talent outside of the shipyard, or outside of the military, or outside of Jefferson Lab or NASA. I think that is sort of where the opportunity is for corporates to get involved. You know, we've got, again, like the report points out, a lot of sort of like deep tech capabilities, lots of aerospace, lots of unmanned system. I mean, we've just got so many deep tech industries here because of like the DoD backbone and the high tech backbone of the large companies in the area. So we take that talent, we, you know, activate it outside of these large employers, and then we incentivize the, you know, entrepreneurs to tackle these sorts of, it's just, I guess I could sort of boil it down to corporate innovation. You've got to get the larger corporates to, you know, get skin in this game. It's very much a contact sport. So
Right on. Right on. You've got a couple other questions for the sake of time. We're right at 1 o'clock, but or just before 1 o'clock, but we're going to go a little long, I think. Barrett and Nancy have both added some commentary about Cox, which is very helpful. Obviously, with the transatlantic cables, and of course, Nancy's comments about Cox being a sponsor of the Small Business Academy with ODU Strome College of Business is great.
More, we need
more better. And so I had brought up the question of tech corridors, and then our friend Alan has popped in some more information about the success, the potential success of plans like that based on some of the regionalism matters that have gotten in our way before. So I'm not sure if everybody's all familiar with the tech corridors being discussed. I know that Norfolk was discussing one. I know there was one discussed on the peninsula. I don't know what the current status is of that. But Oz, what's your experience and what have you seen?
So I think the regionalism question or issue is, it's like the nut that I can't, it's like sort of like my white whale, because I, from my perspective, see the regionalism question as like one of the greater challenges for this area. And to sort of also answer Barrett's question about, are there any other regions that were in our same position 5 or 10 years ago that have made significant gains, and how did they do it? There aren't very many like one-to-one comparisons. However, I can say that, like, you know, the Raleigh-Durham, like the Research Triangle is a great example. One that I can probably speak to a little bit more saliently is the upstate New York technology ecosystem or startup ecosystem. My peer inside of Techstars, who did a community catalyst program, was in sort of like the upstate New York, Buffalo, Rochester region. And the sorts of takeaways that he left me with were that, you know, the regionalism is always going to be an issue for people at a particular level, but it's not an issue for the entrepreneurs. So again, you know, developing sort of like a founder first ecosystem, and not an ecosystem that has to, you know, wait on the region to sort of like get its act together and cooperate, is the kind of ecosystem that's going to produce, you know, high growth venture backable startups for the region. So like, you know, these questions about like tech corridors, or, you know, whether or not regionalism is going to be solved and, you know, we're all going to reap the benefits of that, is almost sort of beside the point. I think that we're at a point now where startups can and really just want to grow their business inside of an ecosystem that we can all see happening around the country. It's almost frustrating for a founder to be sort of caught in the middle of sort of regional, like these regionalism conversations. And I think I'm sort of like going off on a tangent with my answer, but you know, I think there's a lot to be learned from an RDU. Like there's a lot to be learned from Rochester. There's a lot to be learned from even, you know, going back farther than 5 or 10 years ago, the, you know, formation of New York City as a metro. You know, they've got similar physical, geographical challenges as we have now. 7 different boroughs that each have their own thing. And please stop me because I feel like I'm going off track a little bit, but
All very accurate, but what about Richmond? What have you heard about Richmond? I mean, obviously they're, you know, they've got some advantages. There's some disadvantages too, but what do you see as a primary point of differentiation so far?
So I would say, you know, not to beat a dead horse, but they don't have exactly the same like regionalism challenges that we do, in a sense that there seems to be a lot more just cooperation amongst the various components of the ecosystem, the universities, the corporates, the cities, the research institutions, like all of those play better together. But there's also, you know, not exactly something I would call a tech corridor, but there seems to be the like fintech industry emerging as sort of like a powerhouse industry for Richmond. I think that like it can all sort of boil down to focus. And I think focus is the biggest differentiator between Hampton Roads and Richmond. I feel like that's a quotable that might get me in trouble, but.
Well, we're all friends here. We're running short on time, everyone. It's about 1:05. Last call for questions. Rich, are you still out there? I thought you had another question. I don't know if I spoke to it or not. Oz, you've participated. Hold on a second. I'm waiting for Rich's question to come in. Rich, go ahead, and then I've got one more question as well to wrap up with. You can go live with your mic if you'd like, Rich. Well, Rich is talking about patents, and we have been soft as a region on patents. And Oz, I think you and I have even chatted about this before. If you extract some of the patents that, well, if you look at patents and Canon, and people think, oh, Canon, well, Canon's in Hampton Roads, and so the region leads with, you know, patents. No, that's the Canon Japan, where camera patents are being made, and printer patents and such. So it's not the same type of patents that we're talking about. Yet, depending on who you speak to, you can say, look, you know, I got to get a patent, and somebody could tell you a patent is a waste of time, because you will, in today's day and age, there's always patent infringement, and oftentimes you don't want to fight it in court, and then you know, blah blah blah. You compromise and negotiate and share some of the wealth, etc. So I don't know what the current best direction is for IP. I think generally my default position is, there's a lot of IP in the region that one would think we can commercialize. A lot of that is coming out of the research schools. I don't know if Nancy's still online, but I recall that there was a lot of IP with ODU professors, and I would tend to think that that's probably true in some of the other schools as well. But there are challenges in getting that IP to commercialized status, not unlike what we've experienced for many years with NASA. And I hear that process is getting better. So it seems like IP is an important thing to do. I'd like to think that patent infringement is not necessarily a given, or that can't be won in a court of law, even though you have to invest in it. Oz, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, it all depends on the space that you're in. I think that IP is still a very valuable like defense mechanism for the moat that you're trying to build. But, you know, if you're in a fast moving startup, then time is your most defensible, you know, weapon in the fight. So I think that, like, one, it all depends on, you know, the space that you're in and the priorities for your company, whether or not you pursue IP as part of your moat. I will say though, on the point about like IP at NASA and different research institutions and unlocking that, I think that is where this region, I think that it's very much low-hanging fruit, sorry, for the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I think if we can take the talent that wants to do something cool and innovative, and we make it easier for them to sort of like leverage the library of you know, IP that exists in the region from different organizations, and then we encourage them to, you know, develop these as companies. We mentor them along the way. We provide them with subject matter experts and things like that. Then we can sort of like accelerate the development of entrepreneurship activity in the region. Like that's the observation that I think is like my greatest takeaway from this program, is that there are a lot of talented, really entrepreneurial people here, lots of great student talent. I mean, a lot of talent, again, that's sort of like trapped in these larger organizations. Lots of great IP that's being developed at these larger research institutions. And it's just sort of a matter of connecting these dots. We've got really, really, really good bones here in Hampton Roads, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. I think that like it's been this sort of like Techstars vantage point, these like eyes that I've had to see the region through, that have made these points sort of stand out to me. Like, we've got all of the component parts, and IP is one of the things that this region has like in spades. So there's a question from Conway, which is a great question. How long will Techstars be in Hampton Roads? And that answer is until December, or until January 1, I should say. So this is a 1-year contract with Techstars, a 1-year partnership between 757 Collab and Techstars. And so part of the reason why I've really been trying to drive as many people as possible to the startup community Slack is that that will exist forever. And it is the problem, it's a solution that solves multiple problems. I think, you know, the better connected we are, the more productive we are as a startup community. So, you know, pandemic or no pandemic, the online Slack community for founders and supporters in Hampton Roads will be here forever. So I will make a little caveat on that statement, that if you are an organization that would like to do more of this work with Techstars, or partner with Techstars on an accelerator or a founder catalyst, or work with Techstars in some way to keep them in the region, obviously that's a conversation that I would love to have. I think that this year has been really transformative for the region. And I would love to bring more Techstars talent to the area to continue to grow the ecosystem.
Well, I'd like to expand on your comments. I think you're required to help us grow the ecosystem. However, the region needs to grow it, and I think you've got a lot to offer on that topic to a broad base of organizations in the region. And so, one way or the other, we need to continue having Oz as part of this activity. So
I'm a free agent starting in January.
Well, whatever we can do. So I think that probably draws us to the end of the program. You know, I always like to wrap up, like, what's the one thing you think about the character Curly from City Slickers? What's that one thing? And Oz, I think you hit the nail on the head with the IP. There's a lot of wonderful supportive activities happening within the region. We talked about those, and those will continue in one way, shape, or form. But boy, if we can create that flow of IP into our regional resources and build from that, adding in all those supportive activities that are there for them to help grow, I think that's just a wonderful thing. And so what else could accelerate the development of our ecosystem than solid new ideas and products that can be marketed around the world? Seems super important to me. But anyway, with that, I want to thank you Oz personally for giving us an hour plus of your time. It was super informative. Very, very, very good. And I look forward to being able to share the video link for Oz's presentation as well as the slides in short order. But thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants that joined us today. Thank you once again to Cox for their support of this series. And I think that's it. Unless Oz, you've got any final closing remarks, we're ready.
Yes, thanks, Dan, for having me on a Tech Tuesday. I will say that we've got a couple more programs before this Techstars contract wraps. We're going to have an end of year event tentatively scheduled for December 1st. And the best way to stay connected with all of that is to either connect on the Slack, the 757startupcommunity.com to find the Slack link, or find me on LinkedIn as I sort of like post and share this information there. So thanks again for having me. This was a great chat. And yeah, I'll send the slides over.
Thanks again, Oz. Everybody have a great day.